users sign up and log in. Okay, so that's what we want to be doing. And I just want us to kind of sit back and think for a second and say, right, okay, if we want to have the ability to actually track a user, okay, we obviously need to let them register. Okay, so in order to get them to register, we're going to have to put some kind of a form together. Okay, and then when they submit that form, what we'll more than likely do is we'll actually get their details and we'll actually load it into a database table. Okay, and then we'll obviously, that means we have to have a database table for users, and then we need to have the ability to actually add a record to that database table. So we'll be inserting a record. So that's sort of what we're looking at. The other thing then is to do with login. Obviously, you'll need some kind of a login page, naturally enough. And the login page is going to have a form in it as well. Remember that there's you've got your client and you have your server. Okay, the client is what's in the browser window. And if we want to take information or data from the client and send it off to the server, we've got two possible methods or ways of doing it. One is known as the GET method, sometimes also known as URL method, where we actually pass the variable pairs, and a variable pair would be the variable name and the value. We pass them as part of the URL. The other method we can use is the post method. And with the post method, what we actually do is we pass the value pairs as part of a header. So they're not actually visible in the URL. And it's typically called form variables as well as another term in it, because normally what happens is whenever we use a form, we will pass the variables in that form, any of the inputs that we have. So we know all the different types of inputs we have. When you submit you press the submit button, all of those variable pairs, the name of the variable and its value, will then be submitted to as part of the HTTP request to the server, but they'll be done so inside the header. Okay, so that's $post, or the post variables or method, and the get variables or method. Now, interestingly enough, what happens then with PHP on the server is that when we get a communication, a HTTP request from a client, the Apache server that we're running will actually go and it will take all of the post variables and put them into an array, or it'll get all the get variables and put them into an array as well. And it's actually referenced in terms of PHP as $_post, P-O-S-T, all uppercase. And that will be an array. And the elements of the array can be accessed by actually using the name attribute from the HTML input tag. So we have, if you remember, we were using the ID attribute for JavaScript, or get element by ID. The name attribute is used by the server. So what actually happens is that if you have an input, and let's say we have an input called with a name of email, and we actually enter in our email address, so peter.gosling@dkit.ie. When I do submit, there will be a variable pair. Its name will be email, and its value will be peter.gosling@dkit.ie. That could be referenced then on the server using the $_post array, square bracket, quote, email, quote, end of square bracket. And inside that array element will be my email address. Okay, so that's sort of the way that it works, so we need to be aware of. The other thing is as well, in HTTP, the HTTP protocol, it was designed to be what we call stateless, which essentially means that we send a request from the client, the server will process it and send a reply, and that's the end of the communication. Okay. Now, if we are doing something where we want to have the ability to keep track of a user, for example, we want to make it stateful. So what we want to do there is we want to know or identify somehow that when we get a HTTP request, that request is coming from a specific user. Okay. Now, the way that is done is through using a thing called sessions. What a session does is software that tracks communication between a client and a server. And it does it by generating a random code, which is the session ID. And what actually happens then is the server, when we start a session, it will actually go and it will take this randomly generated session ID, and it'll send it as part of the reply back to the browser. The browser then, it will see that, oh, we've got a session ID here, and it will then use that session ID in any communications it will have with the server from then on. Okay, so we get let's say we do something like we're logging in, we log in username, password, hit submit, that sends a request to the server. The server does the login checking and says, yeah, this user can be logged in. I'm now going to start a session, so I generate a session ID key. It sends that session ID key back to the client as part of the HTTP reply. The client, the browser in our case, is going to say, there's a session ID key here. I need to keep a hold of that and send it back to the server every time. Okay, but it's only aware of the current session that it's on. So what will actually happen is that when we next communicate from that particular tab in the browser, the HTTP request will include a session ID. What happens on the server when we start a session is two things. It creates the session ID. The other thing it does is it creates memory space that is available to the session. So we can actually use that memory space, and that's going to be unique to that session ID. We'll actually use that memory space to actually store variables. So for example, we could, if we wanted to, store maybe the username, or we could store the user ID, or we could store whatever we like, really. We don't want to store too much because remember, all that memory takes space and capacity, and we could have thousands of users. So that would be multiplying it out. So we only put important information up there. Okay, typically information that we're going to be reusing all the time. So if, for example, we're going to have it that when somebody logs in the top right-hand corner of their website, it will show their user name, okay, or Peter Gosling or whatever you have there in your teams at the moment, then it would be handy to actually have that stored, because that'll save us having to run a query to get the username. Okay, so that's one of the things that we can do. Now, when we do that, we start tracking a user. So when we get the second request coming in from the client, we can start our session and see, do we have a session ID here? Yes, we have. Therefore, I now know who has sent me the request. Okay, so that allows us to keep track of particular users. So you could have, for example, if you have your browser, and let's say you have two users, you could have two tabs, one for each different user, and communications from one tab will only be to that user. Communication from the other tab would be for the other user, and they won't get mixed up. All of the client and all the server takes care of everything. Okay, so just to let you know. So what we need to do in terms of be able to log in and sign up is obviously we need a table for the database for users. We need some kind of a form to let the user fill in the information. We need some way of being able to process that information so that we can add a record to the database table. Then once that's done, we then allow a user to log in. They will typically log in with a username and password. That username or password, it could be the email address and password. And normally what we do with the password as well is rather than just store it as plain text on the server in the database table, we'll actually encrypt it, and we'll talk about that. So encrypting it essentially means that we're putting it through a mathematical algorithm which changes the plain text into code that are alphanumeric characters that won't let you, by breaking into the database, find out what the password of the user is. Okay, so it's a level of protection that you can have. Also, we need to start a session to keep track of the user, and we also need to be able to log out so that we can destroy the session at a later stage. Okay, so the register form page, you have a new member registered to the site. You'll need details, and that's going to depend on your application. okay, and what your requirements actually are. Minimum would be username and password. Might need email. In actual fact, most sites these days, you'll know yourself, they'll just use your email address, right? Why is that? An email address is unique. There's only one email address in the whole system in the world with with that email address. So we sometimes, and again with applications, it's important. We may not want to have a user have the ability to register under more than one username. So we might actually check to make sure that the email address is unique. Okay. We might need to enter the email twice to make sure to do it right. And you know yourself from registering this it's working. So you could use JavaScript there to check that on the client. The same with the password. Enter your password, re-enter your password. You can do all that with JavaScript before the form is actually submitted. You can also use the HTML tags and CSS attributes as appropriate. So the input type email, for example, will check that at least it seems to be an email address. And then when all the fields are filled out, you need to be able to tell the form what to do when it's submitted. Actually, when you hit the submit button, where does that data go and what do we do with it? Okay. And how do we check things? So that's the type of thing. So it's up to you in your application to, like, if you need to know what the gender of somebody is in order to provide services for it, then obviously that has to be an input. If you need to know their address or the location or whatever, again, all of that stuff is up to you. Client versus server checking, we've kind of gone through some of that kind of stuff there. Some things are best done on the client, some things are best done on the server. Some things can only be done on the server, some things can only be done on the client. And I think you have a good grasp of what that is so far with the JavaScript that we've covered. Sessions, I've just kind of explained that, just recapping on it there. A bit more detail on it. Now, the forms in PHP, any input on the form will be sent to the server when the submit button is clicked. Okay. A very important attribute is the input from the server point of view is the name. So name is equal to a value, no spaces. Okay. I've mentioned this before, I'll say it again. Your best bet is to use the same piece of text for the ID, for the name, for the variable on the server, PHP, that you're going to use to have that contain that value, and if possible, if it's going into a database, for the field in the database. Okay, so for example, I'm going to shortly create a user table that's going to have a field called email. Okay, on the form to register, the ID of that input is going to be email. The name of that input is going to be email. When I'm processing it on the server, its PHP variable name is going to be email as well. Okay. Now, all inputs on a form are sent to the server in an array. Okay. We can use get or post. Done. Always use post for a form. Okay. We can get into the technical details of that in year 2, but always use post. On the registration form, the opening tag, I've given an example of it here, is going to be actions equal to whatever the page name is that you want to execute. So what's actually going to happen is this page here, sign up to underscore insert.php, that's going to be executed on the server when somebody submits this form. Okay. The method that's used is post. And then here we've got an unsubmit equals return check form. Okay. So check form is a JavaScript function and similar to what you've used already, and it will check things like maybe the 2 passwords are the same or the 2 email addresses are the same or whatever. Okay. And there's a little bit of discussion on that there. Client-side checking, obviously you know what to do there. We've done it already. And then the action PHP file. What's going to happen here is that URL, that variable, or that PHP page, that will be executed. Okay. That execution may check certain things. Okay. It'll have to do a number of things. Okay. We'll just look at it here. It has to connect to the database. So we already have our database.php file. So we just require it and that will work fine. Depending on the requirements, you might have to make sure the email address has never been used or the username has never been used before. There might be other fields that need to be checked. Okay. And then the first though, you'll need to get the variables entered into the form so that you can actually use them properly, right? Now, there's the right way and a wrong way of doing this, okay? So attention at this point in time. I'm recommending, which means I'm giving marks for, using the filter underscore input. Okay. If you look on the internet, you'll see loads of cases of it using a thing called isSet to check to see if a variable has been set or not. Okay. The preferred method of doing this is to actually use filter underscore input. There's a link there to give you details of how to use that on the internet. Okay. It will get the array or the variable from the $_post array, all uppercase. Okay, so here's an example here. $email, that's the new variable name we're going to have, is equal to filter underscore input underscore post, and then email in quotes. So what that does there is that email will be an element in the associative array of $underscore post, and it'll extract that value and stick it into $email. If $email doesn't exist in that array, the variable $email will still be created, but will have a value of null in it. So we can test for null to see if it is set or not. Okay. The beauty with this is that if we use $email later on in our code and it doesn't exist, it will exist as null because we use filter input. But if we use just isSet, it wouldn't have been set. It would be give us an error message. Okay, so filter input has a lot more capabilities. We're just looking at the simple aspects of it here. Okay, we need to run a query to check if the email address has been used yet. And remember, we're going to use PDO and so forth for our database interactions. Okay. Now, at this point, I'm just going to escape from that because I want to stop at that point and actually get us all typing and that kind of thing. First thing is I want to go to localhost. That's PHP my admin. Now I'm using a database called My Guitar Shop 1. Okay, and I'm just going to delete my user table here. Drop it. So, okay, so there it is now. So what I want to do now is I'm looking at the structured database here, and I want to create a new table, and I'm going to call it users. Okay. Now, again, just on a practical point of view, guys, I'm using lowercase and I'm using the plural. Okay. And for this one here, I'm going to have 5 fields in it. I want to have the ID. I want to have email. I want to have password. I want to have a user type, and I want to have a timestamp showing the date and time that the user has actually joined. Okay.
Sorry, Peter.
Yep.
You said you're emphasizing now that you're only using like a lowercase u and stuff. It doesn't make a difference. You can sort of use whatever you want, can you? Or does it?
No, when it gets into PHP, it will actually start making a wee bit of a difference.
Okay. Okay.
So I would suggest, Dylan, that one of the best things you can learn at this stage is to be consistent in what you're doing. Okay.
Yeah.
I've mentioned this a few times. Typically for variables, I always start off with a lowercase letter.
Okay.
I use this camelized text. Okay.
No
So
worries.
it's lowercase and then an uppercase for the first letter of each subsequent word as such or abbreviation.
Right. Okay.
But it does actually make a difference in
Okay. No
certain. Yeah, just finish this as well, right? We're using MySQL here. Okay.
Right.
There are other databases out there. There's Microsoft SQL, which is very case sensitive.
Yeah.
There's actually some implementations of MySQL that are very case sensitive as well. Okay. And when it gets into the field names, they are case sensitive.
Right. Okay.
Now, something I wasn't going to get into, but I'll just mention it because it ties in with an answer to that question. PHP is a thing called associative arrays. Okay. So
Right.
normally an array you have, I presume you've covered arrays in Java, have you?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So normally you have an index, so you have array element 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, that's how people normally interact with arrays.
Yeah.
Some programming languages then allow you to have an associative array, in which
Right,
case you actually have a piece of text that links to a specific index. Okay,
Right. Okay.
so rather than going for index 0, I'm going to go for ID. Rather than going for index 1, I'm going to have email and so forth. So you can actually refer to it directly as square bracket quote email rather than square bracket 1. Okay, to access the value. Now you might say why? Okay, when we
Yeah.
run things like queries on MySQL, if we do select asterisk, it will take every column, every field, and it will put it into an array 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in terms of the numeric index, but it will also put it in then with ID, email, password, blah, 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 whatever you have. Okay.
Okay.
Now, you might say, right, so what? Okay. Now, let's say you do a different type of query where you have select email, comma, password from users, da, da, da. Okay. Element 0 in that case will be the email, and element 1 will be the password. On the other hand, if I done select password, comma, email, element 0 would be the password and element 1 would be the email address. Okay.
Yeah.
If I added a third variable and I put it first, you're there thinking, now, is that 1 or is it 2 or is it index 0 or what is it? Okay. So I find the handiest thing is to use the associative array where you just actually reference it to the element. Okay,
Yeah.
the name, the field name as such. And that makes life so much easier. Now that is case sensitive in all
Right.
cases.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
So that's just a long answer to a short question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Okay. Is that all
No
right?
worries.
Yep.
Yeah. 100%. Cheers.
Great. So I'm just going to do 5 here and I click on go. Now, some standardized stuff that comes in here. Okay. The first thing is whenever I'm doing adding with an entity table on a database, I always use an ID. Okay, so just ID there. That will always be an integer. And for some reason, the standardized thing in most web development is to have it 11 characters long. Okay, which means that you can have 11 digits, essentially, is what we're saying there. The other thing is as well, I want to set it up so that it is auto increment. So I need to actually, oops, get rid of that. So I need to click the AI button there, which is auto increment. Okay. Now it'll come up with this dialog box here, setting up the index name as primary, da, da, da. Don't worry about that and just do go. Okay. So what that's doing there is it's actually making the index or the ID field a auto increment. So it means every time we add a record, it will increment by 1. So we don't have to do that manually. Okay. And it will be the primary index. So that is the main way of checking things. Okay. With a primary index, you can only have one value, the same. It has to be unique in that sense. So then the next field here is going to be email. I'm decided I'm going to use email as my username. Okay, just you can have both if you like, but but if you have both, you probably need to check both are unique. Has a variable character. And believe it or not, an email can be 254 characters long. Okay, normally isn't, but that's the maximum it can be. And I once got bitten by that. Then I have password. Okay. Okay. That's going to be a variable character. Okay. Now, I'm going to going to put it as 254, right? But we'll talk about that in a short period of time when we start looking at encryption and so forth. Next thing, I'm going to put in a user type. And I've uppercased the T there. And this is going to help me define whether or not the user is approved, an ordinary user, admin user, whatever I like, okay? So I'm going to have it that when, I'm going to have it as an integer, right? And you can actually add comments. You used to be able to add comments. You can comments here, right? So which one am I on? 4. So I'm just going to here for my referencing, right? 2 is new user. 1 is approved user. 2 is admin. Okay, so I'm going to have an admin user and another user. Now I could later on, I might say to myself that, you know, well, actually, I'll leave it to, I might have is 0 is new user or suspended account. Okay, so it's just a comment. It's not going to do that. Okay, but it lets me know, right, that's what it's going to be. I only need it to be 1 character long then. And you can have a default value here. Okay, so under default, I'm clicking as defined and I'm setting it to 0. So by default, when I add a new user, it is going to have a user type equal to 0. Okay, which means in my registration process, I don't have to worry about it. Okay. Now the last one here is I want to put in the registered date, right? So I'm just going to reg date, right? And it's going to be a thing called a timestamp. There, okay. And for the default, I'll put in current timestamp. Okay, and I don't have to worry about the length. It'll sort that all out by itself. Okay. Now just a note here, don't put in just date. Okay, date is a keyword and you can actually get yourself messed up a wee bit with using date in a query then if things don't work out right. Okay, so I've got ID, I've email, password, user type, date, reg date. Okay, and then I do go or save. And that will save myself there. Okay, so if I browse on that, I don't have that. Okay, I could if I want to just go and insert and put in a record if I so wanted that, but for the moment I don't. Everybody okay with that? Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Now, what I want to do here now, as before the Easter break, we had worked through this whole thing where we had the idea, the templates, the header, the aside, and the footer, and so forth. I've thrown in some CSS to mine, so I'm looking. It looks a little bit like this. Okay, that's my website looks like, which is minor CSS around it. Now, what I want to do here is I want to take my template and I want to save a copy as, and I'm going to call it. I've got it on my website here on the HT docs. I'm going to call it register. I want to call it register. Just actually, I'll call it sign up. Sign up. Let's do this here. Sign up page. No, close that. No. File. Sign up. Okay, so page. Just save that, and I just want to check here that I'm working. Just change that from template to sign up. And we've got the sign up page here. Okay, so what do I want to do in here? Inside the main, then I want to put in a form, and the action equals. Okay, so I'm going to create another file called register.php. Okay, so what's going to happen is when I submit, it will go to that register.php page. Method is equal to post. Now that can be uppercase or lowercase. It doesn't matter because it's HTML side of things. I could give it a form name if I wanted to. I could give it an unsubmit if I wanted to. I'm not going to bother with that. That's just complicating things. And I'll close the form there. Okay. So I'm going to put a label. And I'm going to have an input type equals email. So that'll check to see that it is actually email required. ID equals email. Name then equals, and that's from the server perspective is the important one. And that's what I put there. Password. Now here, if I put the type as password, we all know what that means. It'll put asterisks in, so you won't be able to see what you've actually typed. Its ID then is going to be password. And email is going to be, or the name is going to be password. And then we might do a break. And then we might do a equals. Okay, so that should, I think, give me my form here. Okay, so I can put in I do register. And it comes back and says, oh, object not found. Now, I just want you to highlight here that what you can see is it's gone to a file called localhost DWD1, which is my folder name on localhost on htdocs, register.php. So what's actually happened is when I hit submit, it went to that register.php page, okay, which is good. Now, we better create that register.php page. So we do file, new file. Language is going to be PHP. I'll do file save as, and we call it register. Okay, so now we have the file inside in my folder here. I have register.php, okay, which is good. Now, what do we need to do here? The first thing we want to do is we want to be able to require and connect to the database. So we do require. Okay, well, first of all, actually what we do is we do PHP. Yep. PHP tag in there. And we do require once. Let's do database. No, I actually have that in a folder called include. Look at my setup here. I have a folder include, and inside that folder, I've got my aside, my database footer and header. Okay, so just to tidy things up a wee bit. So this is pointing to where that file actually is. So what will happen there is that'll actually go and it will connect with the database. Okay. Now the first thing I want to do is I want to check to see if the email address actually exists. Okay. Because if it does exist, what I want to do is I want to go back and tell the user, hey, there's a problem here. You need to sort this out. Okay. You can't use that email address. So I need to get the email address. So I'll do $email is equal to filter input underscore post. So that says, right, it's going to be in the post array, right? And its element is going to be called email. So what will happen here is it will go to the $underscore post array. It will look for an element called email. If that exists, it'll take that value. Okay. If it doesn't exist, okay, it won't take the value, but it will set email equal to null. And just to prove that here, I'm just going to do echo $email. Okay, save that. Go back into my browser here. So I've pp at pp.pp and I've pp there for the address, and I go register. And here it prints out pp at pp.ie. Okay, so just proves that it works, right? Now, I'm in here. So that's just a wee way you can check to see if things are working the way you want it to work. So the next thing I want to do now is I want to actually write a query, right? So I'm going to do $query equal to, and it's going to be select asterisk from users where email is equal to, and I'm going to go colon email, semicolon. Right, we'll come back to that now in a minute. What we're going to be doing is going to be using a thing called bind values. So then we're going to, I just need to check something here. So that the names I'm given are the same as the ones that so we're going to get. Okay, so there's $query. So we're going to have $statement is equal to, it's going to be $db. Now $db is the PDO object name that we got when we done the connection with db.php. So from that require once or require once include database.php, it made the PDO connection to the database and it called that object $db. Okay, so it's going to be $db and we do prepare bracket $query. So what will happen now is it will take that variable $query, which is our SQL, select asterisk from users or email is equal to that. We then are going to bind the variable $email with that piece of text colon email. Okay, so we do $statement bind value colon email. So that was the piece of text that we put in there, and then the variable $email. So what that actually does is it substitutes the piece of text that is part of the variable $email for that colon email. Now you might say, well, why don't we just stick $email in there where the colon email is in the query? Okay, and there's a reason for that. Okay, different variables have different requirements. For example, if you have a variable, you can have spaces in it. Okay, so in that case, you need to make sure that your string is within quotes. If you have a date, you have forward slashes in it. And in that case, and actually a timestamp, you have space in it as well, it needs to be within quotes. Now, an integer doesn't need to be within a quote, okay? But how do you know what value is actually in there? So there are different ways of doing this. Some people write a wee function to check to see what it is and so forth. The handiest way is to use the bind value, and it will ensure that if it is a string or if it looks like a string, then it'll be put in quotes. If it's a date stamp or a time and it looks like a date stamp or a time, it'll be put in quotes. If it's just a regular old variable, it'll be put as a variable. Okay, and we don't have to worry about things. Okay, so it's a really useful one to have. Now, the next thing that I would encourage you to do is to use the try catch. We're going to do the statement execute now, but I would put it into a try catch. So I do try, and inside the try is going to be dollar statement. And then on the catch, I'm using PDO exception. I'm going to call it dollar $EX. And inside that, then I'm just going to, this is where you would handle the error. I'm just going to do a very simple echo dollar $EX.get message. If there is an error, that'll actually throw out a message there. Okay, so we've executed the query. Okay, so now we want to see, what are we doing this for? We want to see whether or not the email address exists. Okay, so I'm just going to put a variable, say $count, or dollar number of rows, maybe, is equal to dollar statement, row count. So that will actually come back and tell me if the number of rows that have been there. If the username exists, that will be 1. If the username doesn't exist, it will be 0. Okay. So if statement here now, dollar number of rows is not equal to 0. If it's not equal to 0, it means I have a problem, right? Echo so just do something. The email is in use. Okay. Otherwise, we'll go off and we'll do something else. But for the moment, I'm just going to go echo. Just we'll check this piece out before we go any further. Echo. Email is okay. Right. Everybody with me so far?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so use the same thing there, and I'll just go PP here and register. So email is okay, right? That piece worked. Just going to go back here. I'm just going to do this again, right? Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. Email is okay. I haven't actually. I was very expecting it to go back and say no, the email's in use, but sure, I haven't inserted it. So it's my mistake. So we know that piece there is going to work all right. We hope. So the next bit now is to insert the details database. Okay. Now, an important thing to do here, because we've run a query already, right? We need to use the cursor close. And I've got a mental block of this. Let me just check something here. close cursor. I knew I had it the wrong way around. What close cursor does, right? And again with PHP, go into Google, do your PHP and whatever it is you're looking for, and you get the documentation page here. It's when you do a close cursor, it frees up the connection to the server so that other SQL statements can be issued. So we've got one connection to the MySQL server. Okay, we've got a query running there, so the data, the query has been run. It's still in existence. The memory results are still in existence. We do close cursor, it gets rid of all of that. Okay, so the if you don't do that, it won't let you actually. It thinks you're making a change to the existing query that's been run, so you can't run a different query. So we'll do the close cursor. So we do dollar statement. Cursor, boom, boom. Okay. So that frees up the connection to the database. That means at this point, those previous results on the MySQL server, they're gone. We don't have access to them anymore. So we can do another query. So a dollar query. It's going to be equal to, and what this time what we want to do is we want to insert it. So we've got insert into. Now I'm assuming from your database module, right, that you know how to insert and you know how to select and all of that. But is that right, everybody?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you know, insert into a table, you've got the columns separated by commas,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then the values. Okay, grand. Just to make sure, I remember doing this one time, and there was some people that hadn't done the thing. Right. So now, what do we need to do? We need to insert. We don't need to insert the ID because that's auto incremented. We need to insert email. We need to insert password. We don't need to insert the user type because by default it's going to be 0 because we set that. And we don't need to insert the date time or the timestamp because that is set to default as well. Okay, so we just need these two and then values. It's going to be colon email, comma, colon password. Normally what I would do is I'd just copy and paste all of this, right? Because the nice thing is, well, not all of it. The nice thing is you're keeping, if you keep your variable names all the same, you could do this kind of thing, right? So the bind value is going to be that one. I have another bind value I have to do, so I'll just copy that. It's going to be password. Okay, and then I can execute it, and that will insert it in. Right now, one thing I haven't got, okay, is I don't have the password. Right? I have the email because I got that up here with the filter input. Okay, so I'm just going to copy that, and just before this point here, dollar password, and that's going to be input post password. So you'll see a lot of this is very kind of repetitive, so cut and paste can work out quite nice for doing this type of thing. Okay, that should all work for me there. So I'm just going to save that. Well, so what is good practice to get in is to close the cursor after every query. So you kind of have the standard form for your query, no matter what it is, right? Which is good. Let's put that there. Back in here. Email is okay. And if I go in here and go browse, I have now a new entry in pp at pp.pp. It's got a user type 0 and it's got the registered date, which is 1203. Okay, so that worked out quite nicely. Now I'm just going to try this again because it shouldn't let me register again with the same email address. No problem. The email is okay. All right, yeah. All right. So what it's done here, it says the problem email is in use, and then it's typed email is okay. Okay. So what we need to do here is we really need at this point, right? Problem the email is in use, right? We need to actually send that somewhere different and go back and tell the user that, listen, there's a problem here. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is going to use a thing called the header. The header is when we have the HTTP protocol, we have the HTTP request and then the HTTP reply. Okay, the HTTP reply, it has a field called or a section called the header, and one of the elements in that header is a variable pair, which is location, and then an actual URL. Okay, which is the value that's going to be sent. All right. Now, what I want to do here is I want to change location. And then colon. The colon is used as a separator. So on the left of the colon is the variable name, location, and on the right will be the variable, right? Now I want to send this back to the sign up page, signup.php, right? But I also want to send a message saying, listen, there's a problem here. Okay. So I'm going to use the get method. So we'll actually send the information as part of the URL. So I'm using a question mark. I'm going to give it a variable name. Just call it MSG for message equals. And I'm going to give it the text. There. So we've got location colon signup.php question mark MSG, which is going to be a new variable name, get variable, and I'm assigning it the value problem. The email is in use. Okay. You may have noticed previously, if you look at your emails when you're going through a browser, that it'll have this question mark. It'll also have the and symbol. The and symbol is used to separate second and further variable pairs. It's name and value. You can send quite a few, well, up to 1024 characters through the get method. Okay, so what should happen here now is that will go to a page signup.php and it'll pass the variable message. Right, and just to be sure, I'm doing exit. That'll kill the page. So stop that there now. Go back here. All right, put in and go register. Now it's showing the page here. If you look carefully in the URL, I don't know if that comes out clear from your side, but it's got question mark message equals problem. The email is in use with %20, which is space, the ASCII character for space in between. Okay, so it would be nice to do something with that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into the sign up page. And what I'm going to do here is just at the beginning here, I'm going to have $MSG is equal to filter input underscore get, because it's a get input, and the variable name is MSG. Now, in here then, right, I've got sign up page. What I would like to do, right, actually up there, I would like to have, say here inside the register page, I maybe might want to have a piece of text in red saying there's a problem. Okay, so I'm just going to do a question PHP, which again is just adding a little bit of PHP into the page, and says if dollar message not equal to null. Okay, so if it does actually exist, if there is text in it, it won't be equal to null. Then what I want to do is I want to echo. I think I'll make it a H2. And I'm going to add together then the dollar message text, and then add together closing H2. Okay. If message is null, it won't print that out. If it is null, it will print that out. So I'll just save that. Again, go back in here. Right, so that's doing that because I have that text there. It's not doing it here because there's no message, but if I put in the PP back and you have problem, email is in use. Okay, I'd like that to be in red. So all I need to do then is go to my CSS. Just make sure I don't have a red or an error. I don't. I'll put it here down. Make a new class of color. And what I could do in sign up here, H2 class equals, right. Now, I can't use the double quotes, I need to use single quotes there. Otherwise it'll take it as being the end of a string. Save all of them. And I'll refresh that. Class equals red. That should be. It's all right there. Sometimes this happens. It doesn't do a hard reset or reload. There it is there. Okay. That's just it. It would have looked at the CSS file and said, listen, I downloaded that a few minutes ago. I'm not going to do it again. So just to double check that, I'm going to get rid of this here. So no sign there. Put in the same one again. Register, and it goes back with it in use there. So now I can go and put in a different one. And as email is okay. If I look here and if I refresh, I should have 2 email addresses here now, 2 users. Now there's a problem. I have 3. Right. So what has happened here is it has put in PP twice. So there's something wrong with my code. I think that's because the first time I ran this, I didn't have that. Yeah. Okay. Just going to delete this one. Just going to delete this and then make sure that everything's working. And you can kind of test things as you're going along like that. to make sure it's right. So if I go back here, go back here. Email is in use. Refresh here. Yep, I just have the two of them. So that piece there is working. Okay, everybody okay so far with that?
Yeah.
Okay, now the last thing I want to do is we want to bring in a thing with regard to encrypting the password. Okay, so I'm going to Google here. So it's a thing called password hash. This is sort of the preferred way of putting an encryption method into it. Okay, so it's using the crypt. It's compatible with that default. There's interesting stuff here that you could have a read through yourselves. Okay. Again, it's useful at times to actually put this actually together. Okay. You can add in, and what we'd be recommending is that you have the password and then the bcrypt, and then options you could have if you wanted to. You could put options into the whole thing. Okay. So there's an interesting approach. So I want you to have a look at that. But what we're actually going to do here is we'll just do a password underscore hash, the password variable that we've got, and then actually I'll just cut that. So here we've got we're using $password and just do the B encrypt on it. You could of course just have that there directly in here. Okay, do it all in one stage as such. Save that. Now the difference you're going to see if we look, well, let's do it and see what we have. So dd dd. I've entered the password dd, do a register. And now if I do a refresh here. Say $password is equal to that. Register. So I'll go back here and refresh.